The alarm screamed in Daewon's ears as his ship tore itself apart around him. Metal shrieked against metal, and somewhere behind him the cargo bay exploded in a burst of white fire. He grabbed the emergency release for the life pod, his hands shaking so badly he nearly missed the lever. The pirates had come out of nowhere, 3 ships against his lone cargo vessel. They wanted the rare elements he was carrying. They didn't care that he was just trying to make a living. The pod shot away from the dying ship just as the main reactor went critical. The explosion lit up the darkness of space like a newborn star. Daewon watched through the small window as the morning star, his home for the past 6 years, turned into scattered debris. He was alone now, floating in the black between stars with nothing but a failing life support system and a distress beacon that probably no one would hear. The pod was damaged. He could see the cracks in the oxygen recycler, could hear the slow hiss of air leaking into space. The temperature was dropping too. His breath came out in small clouds. He wrapped his arms around himself and tried not to think about how long it would take to die out here. The beacon kept pulsing its silent call into the void. Daewon closed his eyes and waited. 3 days passed, or maybe it was 4. Time lost meaning in the cold and the dark. Daewon drifted in and out of consciousness. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Every breath hurt. He was so cold he couldn't feel his fingers anymore. When the light appeared outside his pod, he thought he was hallucinating. But the light grew brighter, and then there were sounds. Metal against metal, and suddenly warm air rushed in. Hands reached for him. Not human hands. These were longer, with 3 fingers and a thumb, covered in smooth gray skin. Daewon tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough. The alien creature, whatever it was, lifted him gently. He saw more of them now, moving around him with purpose. Their faces were narrow and angular, with large dark eyes that seemed to reflect every light source. One of them was young, barely more than a child by the look of it, staring at him with open curiosity. They carried him through narrow corridors that smelled like recycled air and something sweet he couldn't identify. The ship was small, maybe a salvage vessel or a transport. Everything was built lower than human standard, making him feel oversized despite his exhaustion. They placed him on a medical bed, and an older female began working on him immediately. She moved with practiced efficiency, attaching monitors, running scanners over his body, muttering in a language that sounded like wind chimes. The young one stayed nearby, watching everything. Their eyes met, and Daewon managed a weak smile. The youngster tilted their head, then mimicked the expression, though it looked strange on their alien features. An older male entered the room, clearly the captain, judging by the way the others deferred to him. He studied Daewon for a long moment, then said something to the medic. She responded with what sounded like concern. Over the next 3 days, Daewon learned they were called Velkrin. The medic was Hyejin, the captain was her husband Tae-yang, and the curious young one was their son Ji-woo. They were a family salvage crew, working the debris fields at the edge of known space. They'd picked up his beacon and diverted from their planned route to find him. It had cost them time and fuel they couldn't really afford to lose. Ji-woo spent hours by his bedside, asking questions in broken but improving human standard. He wanted to know everything about Earth, about human cities, about what it was like to live on a planet with oceans. Daewon answered as best he could, his voice growing stronger each day. The boy brought him strange Velkrin foods, most of which Daewon couldn't digest, but the effort warmed something in his chest that had been cold since the attack. Hyejin worked miracles with the limited medical supplies they had. She treated his frostbite, his dehydration, his cracked ribs. She stayed up all night the first 2 days, monitoring his vital signs, adjusting medications, ensuring he stabilized. Tae-yang checked on him each morning, asking nothing, expecting nothing, just making sure he was improving. On the 4th day, Daewon could sit up. On the 5th, he could walk. On the 6th, they reached the nearest human station. Tae-yang called him to the bridge as they approached. The station grew larger in the viewport, a spinning wheel of metal against the stars. Home, or close enough to it. Daewon turned to the family. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I have nothing to give you. Everything I owned was on that ship. I can't pay you back for the fuel, the time, the medical supplies. I can't even pay for the rescue." Tae-yang studied him with those large, dark eyes. When he spoke, his human standard was careful and precise. "We did not save you for payment. A life is not a transaction. The void is cold and empty, but we do not have to be. My people have a saying, The void remembers kindness. Perhaps it does. Perhaps it doesn't. But we will remember that we had the chance to help and we took it. Jiwoo pressed something into Daewon's hand. It was a small data chip. Our contact information, the young Velcrin said. In case you ever want to talk. I liked learning about Earth. Daewon's throat tightened. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They docked at the station and he walked down the ramp on unsteady legs. At the bottom, he turned back. The Velcrin family stood at the airlock watching him go. He raised his hand in farewell. They returned the gesture. The airlock closed. The ship detached and began moving away, back toward the darkness between stars where salvage crews made their living. Daewon stood there for a long time, watching until it disappeared from sight. He clutched the data chip in his fist. The station authorities found him there eventually, asking questions about his lost ship, about the pirates, about how he survived. He answered mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He was alive because 3 strangers had decided his life was worth saving. They had asked nothing in return, expected nothing. They had simply helped because they could. In a galaxy full of pirates and profiteers, people who would let a man die for convenience, this family had chosen differently. Daewon made his way to the station's commercial sector. He was broke, injured, and alone. But he was alive, and he would not forget the faces of those who had saved him. He would not forget Taeyang's words. The void remembers kindness. Maybe it did. Maybe it was just something people told themselves to feel better about the universe's cruelty. But Daewon would remember. That much he promised himself as he looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the quiet ember was moving through the darkness, carrying a family that had taught him something about what it meant to be decent in an indecent universe. He pressed the data chip against his chest and walked into the station, into whatever future awaited him. He would remember. 20 years changed everything and nothing. Jiwoo ran his own salvage operation now, a small fleet of 3 ships working the same routes his father once traveled. Taeyang and Heejin had retired to a quiet home on Velkar Prime, spending their days in the garden they'd always dreamed of. They talked sometimes about the human they'd rescued so long ago, wondering what had become of him. The data chip had never received a response. They assumed he'd moved on with his life, and that was fine. They hadn't saved him for gratitude. Jiwoo's daughter Bora was 17 now, learning to pilot just as he once had. She had her grandfather's steady hands and her grandmother's quick mind. She'd grown up hearing the story of the rescued human, though it was just one tale among many from her family's decades of salvage work. To her, it was simply what you did. You helped when you could, but the galaxy was changing in ways none of them had anticipated. The first reports came from the far edge of explored space. Colonies going silent, not destroyed by war or plague, but stripped. Every resource taken, every building dismantled, every living thing gone. The attacks followed a pattern, moving steadily inward, world by world. They called the attackers the Harvesters, though no one knew what they really were. Some kind of collective intelligence, perhaps, or maybe just a swarm of machines following ancient programming. It didn't matter. They consumed everything in their path. The Velcrin had never been warriors. Their philosophy was simple. Live quietly, harm no one, help when you can. They had a small defense fleet, mostly there for show and for dealing with pirates. 12 ships total, lightly armed. When the Harvesters appeared on long-range sensors, heading toward Aerith Colony, the Council mobilized everything they had. Aerith was home to 4 million Velcrin. It was a mining colony, profitable and well-established, with schools and parks and lives being lived. Kyungsu, the colony administrator, received the warning with shaking hands. The Harvesters would arrive in 4 days. The defense fleet would take 3 days to get there. The math was simple and terrible. Evacuation began immediately. Every ship that could fly started loading passengers. Children first, then the elderly, then everyone else in whatever order they could manage. But Aerith was big and transport ships were limited. Kyungsu ran the numbers over and over, hoping he'd made a mistake. He hadn't. At best, they could evacuate 2 million people. The rest would still be there when the Harvesters arrived. The Velcrin defense fleet took up position in orbit on the 3rd day. 12 ships against whatever was coming. The commanders knew they couldn't win. They were just there to buy time for the evacuation to continue. Every hour they held meant another 10,000 people saved. They would hold as long as they could. Jiwoo was on Aerith's surface helping coordinate the ground evacuation. He'd volunteered immediately when the call went out. Bora was flying a shuttle, running constant trips between the surface and the transport ships in orbit. They worked without rest, without pause, watching the clock count down. Kyung-soo sent out distress calls to every system within range. The messages were simple: 4 million lives at stake, requesting any assistance possible. He sent them to human space, to the Zentari Concordat, to the Thulian Empire, to independent worlds and corporate fleets. He sent them everywhere and waited for responses. Nothing came. The galaxy was silent. Some systems sent messages of sympathy. Others explained they couldn't risk their own ships against an enemy like the Harvesters. A few corporations offered to sell weapons at premium prices, but no one sent help. Aerith was too far from major trade routes, too remote, too much risk for too little strategic value. The math was cold and clear. 4 million Velkrin weren't worth starting a war with an unknown enemy. The Velkrin Council didn't blame anyone. This was the way of things. Every species looked after their own first. The Velkrin had always known they were small players in galactic politics. They'd chosen that path deliberately, preferring peace to power. Now that choice had a price. On the 4th day, the Harvesters arrived. They appeared at the edge of the system in a formation that made veteran pilots sick to look at. Hundreds of ships, if you could call them that. Organic-looking things that moved like schools of fish, flowing around each other in patterns that seemed to violate physics. They didn't broadcast, didn't communicate, just started moving toward Aerith with patient, inevitable purpose. The Velkrin defense fleet moved to intercept. 12 ships against hundreds. They knew how this would end. But they went anyway, because 2 million people still needed more time. Kyung-soo watched from the command center, feeling the weight of every life still waiting for evacuation. The defense fleet opened fire at maximum range. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted 17 minutes. The Harvesters didn't dodge or maneuver. They simply absorbed the damage and kept coming. When the Velkrin weapons finally managed to destroy one of their ships, it broke apart into dozens of smaller craft that continued the advance. The defense fleet fought with everything they had, and it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. 3 Velkrin ships were destroyed outright. The rest retreated, damaged and burning, back toward Aerith. The Harvesters followed. They would be in orbit within hours. The evacuation was moving as fast as possible, but it wasn't fast enough. It would never be fast enough. Jiwoo worked through the panic on the ground. People were orderly mostly, but you could see the fear. Families being separated, parents putting children on shuttles knowing they might not see them again. The elderly volunteering to stay behind so younger people could evacuate. It was breaking his heart, watching it unfold. Bora landed her shuttle for the 30th time that day. She was exhausted, running on stimulants and adrenaline. The shuttle was old and overloaded, but it kept flying. She would keep flying it until the end. Another 100 people loaded on. She lifted off again, heading for orbit. In the command center, Kyung-soo made the final calculations. 1.8 million people evacuated, 2.2 million still on the ground. The Harvesters would reach orbit in 3 hours. The transports would be gone in 2, running for the edge of the system before they got trapped. He looked at the numbers and felt something break inside him. He sent one final message, broadcasting on every frequency he had. No fancy words this time, just the truth. This is Aerith Colony. We have 2 million people who are going to die in 3 hours. If anyone can hear this, if anyone cares, please help us. The message went out into the void. Kyung-soo slumped in his chair, staring at the screens showing Harvester ships drawing closer. The void was cold and empty. They had always known that. His people had a saying, the void remembers kindness. It was something they told themselves to feel better about the universe's cruelty. But the void didn't remember anything. It was just empty space, indifferent to suffering, uncaring about whether 4 million or 4 billion died. Kyung-soo watched the Harvesters approach and wished he believed in something larger than the cold mathematics of survival. The screens showed their inexorable advance. The countdown continued and the void remained silent. Admiral Daewon was reviewing patrol reports when the distress call came through. His office was on the flagship of the 3rd Human Expeditionary Fleet, a massive carrier called the Resolute. 20 years of service had taken him from rescued survivor to one of the most respected officers in the Human Alliance. He'd earned it through competence and courage, leading from the front, never asking his people to take risks he wouldn't take himself. The communication officer forwarded him the message from Aerith. Standard procedure for any distress call within sensor range, even from outside human territory. Day one almost deleted it. They got hundreds of these. Space was dangerous and the fleet couldn't respond to everything. But something made him look at the header information. Velcrin Colony, Aerith System. His hand froze on the display. He pulled up the full message, reading it carefully. Then he accessed the navigation database, cross-referencing the coordinates. His chest tightened. He opened his personal files, the ones he'd kept for 20 years, and pulled up a data chip's information. The Quiet Ember, Captain Tae Yang. The coordinates where they'd found him, floating in a damaged life pod, more dead than alive. Commander Youngmi entered his office without knocking. She'd been his second-in-command for 5 years, long enough to read his expressions. "Sir, you look like you've seen a ghost." Daewon turned the display toward her. "How long would it take us to reach these coordinates at maximum burn?" Young Mai studied the data. "That's outside our patrol zone." "Way outside. We'd need authorization from Fleet Command. And even with maximum burn, we're looking at 6 days minimum." "Why? How long do they have?" Daewon asked, pointing at the distress call. "According to this, 4 days until the harvesters arrive. Maybe 5 if they're lucky." Young Mi's expression shifted as she understood. "Sir, we can't make it in time. And even if we could, this isn't our jurisdiction. The Velcrin aren't part of the Alliance." Daewon stood up, walking to the viewport. 47 ships hung in formation outside, the bulk of the Third Fleet. Carriers, dreadnoughts, destroyers, support vessels. Thousands of crew, all following his orders. "Get me Fleet Command. Priority channel." The conversation with Fleet Command was brief and one-sided. The answer was no. Deploying an entire battle group outside human territory, into a combat situation with an unknown enemy, to defend a non-alliance colony, was not approved. The risk was too high. The political complications were too complex. The Velcrin had never assisted humanity in any military capacity. There was no treaty, no obligation. The fleet would remain on station. Daewon ended the call. He stood silent for a long moment, then keyed the fleet-wide communication channel. Every ship, every officer, every crew member would hear this. "This is Admiral Daewon. 20 years ago, I was a cargo pilot who got hit by pirates. My ship was destroyed. I made it to a life pod, but it was damaged. I was dying in the cold and dark when a Velcrin salvage ship picked up my beacon. They were 3 days out of their way. They had their own schedule, their own needs, but they came anyway." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The family that saved me never asked for anything in return. The father told me something I've never forgotten. He said a life is not a transaction. They saved me because they could. Because it was right. Now that family's people are dying. 4 million of them, and I just got orders to stay here and do nothing." The fleet channel was silent. Thousands of people listening. "I'm going to Aerith," Daewon continued. "I'm taking the Resolute, and I'm going to get there in time if I have to burn out every engine on this ship." "This is not an order. Fleet Command has forbidden it. Anyone who follows me will face court-martial. Anyone who stays will have my complete understanding. But I have to ask, who remembers why we wear these uniforms?" The channel erupted. Captain after captain, ship after ship reporting their intention to follow. The entire fleet. 47 ships. Not one stayed behind. Daewon felt something crack in his chest, some tight band he'd been carrying for 20 years. Young Mai was grinning. "Well, sir, looks like we're all going to get court-martialed together." "Set course for Aerith," Daewon ordered. "All ships, maximum burn. Engineering, I want you to push those engines past every safety limit. We need to do 6 days in 4. The fleet turned as one, massive ships reorienting toward distant coordinates. The engines burned hot, hotter than regulations allowed. Engineers monitored systems that were screaming warnings, making constant adjustments to keep everything from flying apart. The ships shook with the strain. It didn't matter. They pushed harder. Captain Sung Ho, commanding the carrier Indomitable, reported engine temperatures reaching critical levels. Daewon authorized him to continue. Every ship reported similar issues. Every ship kept going. The pilots checked their fighters, running through pre-flight sequences. The Marines prepared their gear. Medical teams stocked supplies. Everyone knew what was coming. 3.5 days later, bleeding speed and heat, the fleet translated into real space at the edge of the Aerith system. The displays lit up immediately. Harvester ships, hundreds of them, already in orbit around Aerith. The Velcrin defense fleet, what was left of it, was down to 7 ships. Evacuation transports were running for the system's edge, overloaded with refugees. On the planet below, millions waited for death. Day 1 broadcast on all frequencies, human and Velcrin. This is the 3rd human expeditionary fleet. Velcrin forces, please transmit friendly identification codes. We're here to help. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then the Velcrin commander responded, his voice shaking. Human fleet, this is Defense Commander Wu Jin. You're really here? We're really here, Day 1 confirmed. He switched to a specific frequency, one he'd kept in his records for 20 years. Captain Tae Yang, if you're listening, this is Day 1. You told me the Void remembers kindness. Maybe it does. But I know humans do. We remember, and we came. The response came from the planet's surface, an older voice weathered by time. Day 1? The cargo pilot? You became an admiral? I became someone who could bring a fleet when you needed it. Day 1 replied. Now let's save your people. He switched back to fleet-wide. All ships, battle stations. Fighters launch. Target the harvester ships in orbit. Clear a path for those evacuation transports. Marines, prepare for surface deployment. We're holding the system until every last Velcrin is safe. The Resolute's fighter bays opened, spilling hundreds of small craft into space. The dreadnoughts moved forward, their massive guns charging. The harvesters turned toward this new threat, their alien ships flowing into new formations. The battle for Aerith was about to begin. Day 1 watched the displays fill with targeting data. 47 human ships against hundreds of harvesters. The math wasn't good, but he'd faced bad math before, floating in a dying life pod, and someone had come for him anyway. Now it was his turn. The fleet moved forward as one, engines burning, weapons hot, ready to prove that humanity never forgot a debt. Young Mi stood beside him, watching the tactical display. Sir, even if we win, we're all going to face court-martial when we get home. Day 1 smiled. Then let's make sure we win first. The first shots fired and space lit up with violence. The human fleet crashed into the harvester formation like a hammer. Day 1 gripped the railing of his command station and thought of a Velcrin family that had saved a stranger for no reason, except that it was right. The Void might remember kindness, but today it would remember something else. Today it would remember that humans paid their debts. The harvesters were unlike anything in human combat doctrine. They didn't fight like ships. They fought like a living organism, each vessel part of a larger whole. When human railguns tore through their hulls, the damaged ships didn't retreat. They broke apart into smaller units that kept attacking. When missiles found their targets, the explosions seemed to birth new craft from the debris. Captain So Yun led her fighter squadron in the first attack wave. 40 fighters, the best pilots in the fleet, diving into the harvester formation. She locked onto the nearest target, fired her missiles, and watched them connect. The harvester ship shuddered, split in half, and then both halves sprouted new weapons and kept coming. Command, this is Tiger Leader. Standard tactics aren't working. These things adapt. Acknowledged, Tiger Leader. Young Mai responded from the Resolute. Switch to close-range plasma. Don't give them time to adapt. So Yun pulled her fighter into a tight turn, the G-forces crushing her into her seat despite the compensators. Her squadron followed, tight and disciplined. They came in fast, plasma cannons blazing at point-blank range. The heat was intense enough to melt through harvester hulls before they could repair. Ships died in bursts of light, but there were so many. For every one they killed, 3 more took its place. The dreadnought's hammer and anvil pushed forward, their massive bulk absorbing harvester weapons fire. Their main guns, designed to crack planetary fortifications, fired in sequence. Each shot was a spear of concentrated energy that could punch through a kilometer of solid metal. The harvesters died in groups, but the swarm kept coming. It was like fighting the ocean. On Aerith's surface, Jiwoo watched the battle through the command center's view screens. Human ships were dying up there, buying time for evacuation to continue. He'd lived his whole life believing in his father's philosophy, that you helped when you could. Now he was watching strangers die to save his people. The weight of it was crushing. We need to move faster, he said to Minji, the civilian coordinator. Those ships won't last forever. Minji was already working 3 screens at once, coordinating landing zones and transport schedules. We're at maximum capacity. Any faster and people will get hurt in the rush. They'll get hurt worse if they're still here when the harvesters land, Jiwoo replied. He activated his communicator. Bora, status report. His daughter's voice came back tired but steady. 30-second run complete. Loading for 33. Dad, the human fighters are taking heavy losses. I'm seeing escape pods everywhere. Focus on the mission, Jiwoo told her, though his heart ached. We save as many as we can. In orbit, the carrier Indomitable coordinated the fighter screen while its point defense guns created walls of fire against harvester attack craft. Captain Sung-ho watched his tactical display with growing concern. The harvesters weren't just numerous, they were learning. Each attack wave adapted to human tactics. They were starting to anticipate fighter movements to counter point defense patterns. Sir, we're losing effectiveness, his tactical officer reported. They're learning faster than we can adapt, Sung-ho nodded. He'd seen the analysis. The longer this battle went, the worse their odds became. They needed to do something unexpected, something the harvesters couldn't learn fast enough to counter. He pulled up engineering schematics studying the Indomitable's reactor systems. An idea formed, terrible and necessary. The harvesters pushed harder. A group of their ships broke through the human line, heading for the evacuation transports fleeing the system. So-yun's squadron intercepted, but there were too many. She watched in horror as harvester weapons tore into a transport's engines. The ship lurched, losing power, thousands of Velcrin refugees aboard. Tiger Squadron, cover that transport, So-yun ordered. Her fighters formed a protective screen, taking fire meant for the helpless vessel. 2 fighters died in seconds. 3 more were damaged, but the transport's engines restarted, and it limped away toward the system's edge. So-yun's cockpit was full of warning lights. Her fighter was dying around her, but she kept flying, kept shooting. The dreadnought Hammer took a concentrated attack from 30 harvester ships. Its shields collapsed. Weapons fire ripped through armor plating, tearing into the hull. Internal explosions bloomed along its length. The captain gave the evacuation order, and escape pods began launching. But Hammer stayed in the fight, guns firing even as it broke apart. It died, buying 30 more seconds for the evacuation. Admiral Daewon watched from the Resolute's bridge as the battle turned against them. They'd saved millions, but the cost was mounting. 8 ships destroyed, dozens more damaged. The harvesters kept coming, kept learning. He'd known this might happen. They all had. But knowing and experiencing were different things. Sir, Captain Sung-ho is requesting a private channel, Young-mi reported. Daewon accepted the connection. Sung-ho's face appeared, calm despite the chaos visible behind him on the Indomitable's bridge. Admiral, I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. Tell me, Sung-ho explained. The Indomitable was heavily damaged already. Her engines were failing. Life support was compromised in 3 sections, but her reactor was still functional. If they could lure the Harvester flagship close enough, if they could detonate the reactor at the right moment, the explosion would take out everything in a 5-kilometer radius. Daewon closed his eyes. You're talking about a suicide run. I'm talking about saving 4 million people, Sung-ho replied. My crew is already evacuating. I'll stay behind to pilot her in. 1 ship, 1 man for those millions. That's good math, Admiral. Sung-ho, we both know this is the play. Sung-ho interrupted gently. The harvesters are learning too fast. We need something they can't adapt to in time. This is it, Daewon wanted to refuse. Wanted to order Sung-ho to stand down to find another way. But he'd been a military commander long enough to recognize when there wasn't another way. You're a good man, Captain. I learned from the best, sir. Indomitable out, the channel closed. Daewon watched on the tactical display as the Indomitable broke formation, accelerating toward the Harvester flagship. The massive enemy vessel, 3 kilometers of living metal and adapted technology, noticed the approach. Smaller Harvester ships moved to intercept. The Indomitable's point defense guns blazed, clearing a path. Escape pods launched in a steady stream, picked up by other human ships. So-yun's squadron formed up on the Indomitable, providing cover. They all knew what was happening. No one questioned it. They just flew, buying seconds with their lives. 2 more fighters died, then 3. So-yun's fighter was barely responsive, half her systems offline. She kept flying. The Indomitable closed to 5 kilometers, 3 kilometers. Sung-ho sat alone on the bridge, hand steady on the manual controls. The ship shook with impacts. Screens exploded around him. Fire broke out in 3 places. He kept flying, 1 kilometer. The Harvester flagship filled his view screen, alien and incomprehensible. He thought about his wife on Earth, his son who'd just started university. He thought about a cargo pilot who'd been saved by strangers and became an admiral to pay that debt forward. For Aerith, Sung-Ho whispered, and initiated the reactor overload. The Indomitable's reactor went critical in a carefully controlled cascade. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface, a new sun born and dying in an instant. The Harvester flagship and everything around it simply ceased to exist, torn apart at the atomic level. The blast wave pushed out, hitting surrounding Harvester ships, overwhelming their adaptive systems with pure destructive force. The Harvester swarm faltered. Their flagship was gone, and with it whatever intelligence coordinated their movements. The ships began acting independently, less efficient, more vulnerable. The human fleet pressed the advantage, targeting the confusion, breaking formations. On the surface, Jiwoo watched the explosion through the view screen and understood what it meant. A human captain had just died to save them. He looked at the evacuation counters. 3.9 million evacuated, 100,000 still on the ground. They had time now. Not much, but enough. All shuttles, maximum effort, he broadcast. We're getting everyone out. The battle raged for 6 more hours, but the tide had turned. The Harvesters, disorganized without their flagship, were being destroyed faster than they could adapt. The human fleet, bloodied and battered, held the line. Every transport made it out. Every refugee got away. When the last shuttle lifted off from Aerith, Jiwoo was on it, watching his colony disappear below. In orbit, Admiral Daewon counted the cost. 11 ships destroyed, 8,000 dead, 30,000 wounded, and 4 million Velcrin saved. He thought about Sung-Ho, about all the others who'd died today, about whether any of it meant anything in the cold mathematics of the universe. Then he thought about Taeyang's words from 20 years ago. A life is not a transaction. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe the universe didn't care about kindness or sacrifice, but humans did. That had to mean something. All ships form up, he ordered. We're going home. The human fleet limped back to Alliance space like wounded animals seeking shelter. The ships were scarred and broken, held together by emergency repairs and the stubborn will of their crews. They'd left Aerith with 4 million refugees distributed across every vessel that could hold them. Velcrin families huddled in cargo bays, in crew quarters, anywhere there was space. The humans gave up their own beds, shared their food, treated Velcrin wounded in their medical bays. Admiral Daewon stood on the Resolute's bridge and watched the approach to Earth. Home. He'd saved them, brought them through impossible odds, and now he had to face the consequences. Fleet Command had been sending increasingly angry messages throughout the journey back. Words like insubordination, desertion, reckless endangerment. The court-martial was already scheduled. Sir, incoming transmission from Fleet Command, Young Mai reported. They're ordering us to remain in formation and prepare to transfer command. Daewon nodded. He'd expected this. Acknowledged the order. All ships maintain current formation. Before anything else could happen, another ship appeared on long-range sensors. No, not one ship. Dozens. The Velcrin Council had sent a delegation led by their greatest diplomatic vessel. Taeyang was aboard along with other council members. They'd beaten the human fleet to Earth by 2 days, waiting for this moment. The Velcrin ship requested permission to dock with the Resolute. Fleet Command, caught off guard, had to grant it. Diplomatic protocols overrode military discipline, at least temporarily. Daewon went to meet them in the docking bay, his dress uniform immaculate despite everything. It felt strange, wearing formal clothes after weeks of combat operations. Taeyang emerged first. He was old now, his gray skin wrinkled, moving with the careful slowness of age. But his eyes were the same, large and dark and kind. Behind him came other Velcrin dignitaries, including Heejin, Jiwoo, and young Bo-Ra. Seeing them alive, seeing them safe, made something loosen in Daewon's chest. Captain Taeyang, Daewon said formally, though he wanted to embrace the old alien. Welcome aboard. Admiral Daewon, Taeyang replied in perfect human standard. Thank you for saving my people. The two groups stood there in the docking bay, human and Velcrin, neither quite knowing what to say. Finally, Taeyang smiled. I think we should speak with your leaders. There are things that need to be said. The Human Alliance Assembly convened the next day. The chamber was packed, representatives from every human world present. Fleet Admiral Chen presided, her face stern. The charges against Daewon and his fleet were serious. Desertion during wartime, unauthorized military action, risking an entire battle group without approval. The penalties could include life imprisonment. Daewon stood at attention in the center of the chamber, his officers beside him. Young Mi So-yun, the captains of every surviving ship. They wore their dress uniforms, medals gleaming. They'd all agreed to face this together. If one went down, they all did. Fleet Admiral Chen began reading the charges. Her voice echoed in the vast chamber. Each word was a nail in their coffins, building the case for their guilt. Daewon listened without reaction. He'd made his choice at Aerith, he'd make it again. Then the chamber doors opened. Taeyang entered, supported by Jiwoo. Behind them came the rest of the Velcrin delegation. The proceedings stopped. No one had expected this. Diplomatic protocol required acknowledging them. Chen had no choice but to recognize Taeyang's request to speak. The old Velcrin made his way slowly to the speaking platform. He looked around at the assembled humans, these strange tall creatures with their round eyes and expressive faces. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, translated into human standard by the chamber's systems. 20 years ago, my family rescued a human named Daewon. His ship was destroyed. He was dying. We were 3 days out of our way, but we went anyway. We saved him because we could. Because a life is not a transaction. Taeyang paused, looking at Daewon. We never expected anything in return. That is not why you help someone. The chamber was silent. Every eye was on the old alien. But then our people were dying. 4 million of us waiting for the harvesters to come. We sent distress calls to everyone. No one answered. The galaxy is large and we are small. Everyone had reasons not to help. Good reasons. Political reasons. Strategic reasons. He turned to look at Fleet Admiral Chen. You had those reasons too. You told Admiral Daewon not to go. Chen's face remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Taeyang continued. But he came anyway. He brought an entire fleet. He lost 11 ships. 8,000 of your people died for strangers, not for allies, not for strategic value, just because once long ago we helped one man and he remembered. Taeyang's voice grew stronger. You charge him with desertion, with unauthorized action. You say he broke your laws. Perhaps he did. But I tell you this, those 8,000 humans who died at Aerith died as heroes. They died proving that humanity is something rare in this galaxy, something precious. They died proving that humans don't forget kindness. The old Velcrin reached into his robe and pulled out a datapad. The Velcrin Council has authorized me to offer something we have never offered any species in our history. A formal military alliance, full defensive pact, mutual aid, technology sharing. We are small, but we have resources, knowledge. We would stand with humanity not because we must, but because you have shown us what you are. He set the datapad on the podium. But this offer has a condition. Admiral Daewon and every member of his fleet must be pardoned, honored. If you punish them for saving my people, then our species have nothing to discuss. We will not ally with a civilization that destroys its heroes. The chamber erupted. Representatives shouting, arguing, some supporting, some opposing. Chen called for order, her gavel echoing like gunshots. It took 10 minutes to restore quiet. When it was achieved, she looked at Taeyang with something like respect. The council will deliberate, she said. But I think I know what the outcome will be. She was right. 3 hours later, all charges were dropped. Daewon and his fleet were not only pardoned, but decorated. The Velcrin alliance was accepted unanimously. Earth had gained a true friend, and it had cost them nothing but admitting that sometimes breaking rules was the right thing to do. That night, Daewon met with Taeyang privately in the garden of the Velcrin embassy. The old alien sat on a bench looking up at Earth's moon. Daewon sat beside him, and for a long time they said nothing. I'm sorry I never called, Daewon finally said. After you saved me. I meant to. Life just happened. Taeyang smiled. We understood. You owed us nothing. That was the point. But I did owe you, Daewon said. Everything I am, I owe to you. If you hadn't come for me, I would have died in that pod. And if you hadn't come for us, 4 million of my people would have died, Taeyang replied. So now we are even? Daewon thought about it. No, I don't think we're even. I think we're something better than even. I think we're friends. Taeyang's smile widened. Yes, friends, that is much better than even. The old Velcrin died 3 weeks later peacefully in his sleep. He'd lived to see his people saved and a new alliance forged. His funeral was attended by thousands, human and Velcrin both. Day 1 gave the eulogy, speaking about a salvage captain who'd taught the galaxy something about kindness. 1 year after the Battle of Areth, a memorial station was completed. It floated in space at the exact coordinates where Tai Yang had found Day 1's life pod so many years ago. The station was jointly built, human and Velcrin working side by side. It served as a waypoint for travelers, a rescue station, a symbol. The dedication ceremony was attended by both species leadership. Day 1 stood with Jiwoo and Bora, looking at the station through the viewport. On its hull, in letters large enough to see from orbit, was an inscription in both languages. The void remembers kindness, and so do we. Inside the station, a museum told the story. Pictures of Tai Yang and his family, the wreckage of Day 1's life pod, preserved. Records of the battle at Areth, names of those who died. It was a reminder for anyone who visited of what had happened here, of what one act of kindness had become. Jae-hoon was 17 when he visited the station for the first time. He was a young Velcrin, one of the children evacuated from Areth. He stood in the museum reading the stories, looking at the pictures of human ships dying to save his people. Something stirred in him, a feeling he couldn't name. He enlisted in the joint Human-Velcrin Defense Force the next day. When asked why, he said simply, "Because someone showed my people what it means to answer a call. I want to be someone who answers too." He wasn't alone. Thousands of young Velcrin joined, thousands of humans too, inspired by the story. The Defense Force grew into something powerful, not because of technology or numbers, but because of what it represented, the idea that kindness mattered, that debts of honor were real things, that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do. Admiral Day 1 retired 5 years after Areth. He'd done his part. He spent his remaining years teaching at the Naval Academy, telling students about the day his ship was destroyed, about the family that saved him, about the debt he'd spent 20 years preparing to repay. Some students thought it was a fairy tale. Others understood it was a blueprint,